Let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's standing room only right now, but we'll go ahead and get started. Don't want to hold you here all night. But as we talked about before, about the overall CIP, we've been having different meetings with our various departments throughout the city pertaining to our current as well as future CIP. But the focus has been primarily on moving forward in 21 to 25 in terms of looking at the existing funding strategies as well as future funding strategies, and then providing the timelines for completion and the funding structure. But as I always say, about the funding piece of it is how do we move forward and how do we get things done instead of kicking the can down the road, so to speak, and being at a point where we run out of road in our overall capital projects and looking at it funding over the next few years. My main concern has been the use of the existing INS fund balance to offset some of the costs coming from the general funds to support the overall debt. Through this process, as we look at it, we've been looking at the overall projects and how they're being funded over the next few years, and wanted to make sure that those projects were still relevant or still in the plan to move forward. My other concern was looking at projects that we've done studies on, but actually haven't attached funding to. So as we move forward, I want to make sure that when we do these studies for these projects, that we do have funding attached to it moving forward. But also to look at the consolidation of different projects that we're doing, especially when we're talking about working with the schools and looking at our overall facilities in terms of us putting capital dollars into those facilities over a period of time when we talk about the replacement of different facilities and making sure that we do have the necessary funding for that. But as I said before, I want to make sure that we don't put too much of a tax burden on future city councils to make sure that we're looking at these overall projects and making sure that we do space it out and we look at it strategically in terms of how we identify the projects that we're going to do within a given time frame. So with that said, because over time, if that does occur, you have to look at the INS fund balance depleting by fiscal year 2026, and then having to look at the general fund and make some heavy decisions in terms of looking at do you increase the tax rate to be able to fund these additional projects, or do we look at it in terms of reducing our level of public services to be able to accommodate those debt service payments. When we look at it over a period of time from here up until that time, you'll start to see that increase in the amount of debt service that we pay, and it significantly jumps in terms of our annual payments. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Chrissy and Ryan to be able to go through our proposed capital planning process and where we are today, as well as Public Works, and looking at our overall assets in terms of looking at ways that we can try to reduce some of our overall expenditures. That could be for planned projects such as for a replacement program. Instead of utilizing a large bulk of money at one time, we look at phasing it in over a period of time. Put money towards it each year until we get to that renewal year. This is also inclusive of looking at our overall vehicles throughout the city and their uses and being able to look at some cost reductions there. So within this plan, we're looking at various ways where we can consolidate some things as well as look at cost reduction across the board in terms of all of our capital projects. So I'll turn it over to Chrissy.
So, good evening. Couple of process changes that we've kicked off internally this year with the CIP process is that we did ask departments to go in and look at and provide updates and spend rates on projects that are existing that are already funded in the CIP to sort of update us on where they are with those and when they plan on spending that money. We also asked them to go back and look at what they had projected for expenses in 21 through 24 last year, so years 2 through 5. And then in addition, we asked that they not submit any new request unless it was considered essential. And based on that, an essential definition was basically that it would require or was meeting some type of legal mandate, or it would eliminate or prevent an existing health or environmental or safety and security hazard. So those were the guidelines that were given to departments. They were due on the next slide. Well, let me talk about neighborhood submissions. We also continued that from last year. That was a new process that we started last year. We actually sent those out in July and gave neighborhoods more time, so they have from July to the end of September to actually submit any CIP processes that they have. Did you
And
have a
what was
question?
the mechanism by which that was communicated to neighborhoods?
We sent out an email, and we also provided information at the last quarterly
Okay.
leadership meeting. And so with that, we also sent out a more simplified request form. It was a little more open and open-ended, so that they didn't have to provide information related to strategic plan or comp plan, just to basically give us more information about the project, so that then we can look at that from there.
And I have one question about the definition of a new request. Some things that got pushed out of our CIP last year as we were looking at some housing priorities,
Mhm.
things that were just pushed out because of that, that wouldn't be considered a new request if they wanted to bring that back in? And I'm just trying to think of examples, or were they just pushed out in time? Or I'm just trying to understand. The one example I actually brought up with Ryan earlier today was the $3 million for McIntyre Park's infrastructure. Is that even out there still? Would that be considered a new request if Brian's team brought that up again? I'm just trying to understand.
So good question. That is one thing that I didn't mention, is that we did ask them to go back and look at the unfunded list from
Yes.
last year. So I'm assuming that project was on the unfunded list.
Okay.
We asked them to provide updates on that.
So they wouldn't be considered new requests, they're just unfunded requests?
Correct.
They already established, okay, thank
Correct.
you.
Yes. So next slide. So in terms of a timeline, we gave departments until August 30th to submit their request to the budget office. During the month of September, we'll be spending time where departments are actually meeting with the budget staff and the city manager to talk about all of their pieces and parts to their CIP request. And then in the month of October, the city manager and staff will be working on developing the actual proposed CIP. In terms of city council, we'll be coming to you on November 14th with the preliminary discussion about that. That's a work session. And then March 2nd, we'll be presenting the actual final proposed CIP. And I'm going to turn it over to Marty Selman from Public Works to talk about infrastructure.
Good evening, everybody. This slide right here is just kind of a general overview of our assets throughout the city. It's broken out into general government, which is a lot of our street infrastructure and equipment related to that. Public safety, mostly from a vehicle standpoint, education components, parks and rec, and utilities with gas, water, sewer, and stormwater. A lot of these figures, I think they change year to year based on putting in new infrastructure. And one of the things that we took on this year was a citywide survey using LiDAR technology to survey the entire city and collect data on our street systems. So we're getting really good data on our asphalt condition, what our assets are exactly from a quantity standpoint, guardrail locations, quantities, sidewalks, ADA ramps, things like that. And so each year we're going to be building upon that initial survey, and we're going to be using that to sort of prioritize funding and as well as just prioritize the sequence in which we do work.
What did you call the survey, or what was the?
We used a firm called Transmap,
Transmap.
that used LiDAR technology. It's a type of a radar, I guess, that uses really light technology to collect the data. This slide here, the numbers are kind of hard to read, but this was actually put together just recently. We got a lot of the data from our firm that did the survey yesterday, actually. And so these numbers here are very, very accurate. And what it shows is that, you know, in that top column of the chart there, it kind of shows the various categories that our streets can lie, for example, from failed all the way up to good. Obviously, we want all of our streets to be at least in the satisfactory level, which has a minimum PCI score of 71, and PCI stands for Pavement Condition Index. And so what we did is we looked at all the square yards of our entire street network and kind of factored those into the various PCI levels. And it was good to see that more than half of our streets already fall within that satisfactory or above range. And our citywide weighted average for PCI score was 68.5. So citywide average, we're only 2.5 points away from being satisfactory across the city. But there's a lot of streets out there that are in that poor to fair condition, and then a few in the failed and serious condition. And so that bottom row is a projection of what it's going to cost to bring those streets up to at least a satisfactory or good condition. And so as you can see, if we were to bring all of our streets up to a satisfactory condition, we're looking at about $17 million to do that.
And where are the streets? Is there a list of which streets are?
We do, yes. We have a list of every single street in the city. We have two main spreadsheets right now. One's broken out by street, the other one's broken out by segment. But we do have that data.
And that map, though, to the right, kind of, it's hard to read here, but there's probably a larger version that shows it by color code.
Yes, exactly. Yep. In green,
So it's pretty dispersed.
being the good streets, and as you get down, it goes to red and gray for failed. And so yeah, kind of the point of this slide really is just to sort of kind of reiterate the importance of providing the funding to maintain our infrastructure. You know, pavement is one of those things that a street that's in fair condition may still ride well, but the longer we ignore it, the more it breaks down, the water gets into the subbase and starts softening the subbase, and the next thing you know, you go really quickly from fair to poor, very poor, or even serious condition. So
And it will
I think
cost more to fix that.
What's that?
Long term, it actually costs more of an investment if you
Exactly.
let it go that.
Yep.
So what's the current process to determine which streets are fixed first?
We typically just go with the lowest score PCI streets. So what we'll do now that we've got this data is we'll put together a large spreadsheet essentially and send it out to the departments in the city that do work within the right of way. And we will defer streets that have potential city projects on them. Like if there's a utility project on a street or something like that, we'll kind of push that one out if we can. If the score is low enough that we absolutely have to get out there and do something, we will. Sometimes we'll go out and do some large mill and pave areas just to kind of address very isolated areas that are failing. But typically we prioritize based on the PCI score. And so the lower the PCI score, the higher priority it is.
Well, in this case, there's the numbers, because there's fewer streets that are in the absolutely failed and serious mode, so the numbers are less. I guess with in the current world we're in, not even looking at a future budget, in the current state, what's the timeline in which we think we would be kind of addressing, I guess, the most serious of failed and serious? Like, how long out is this going to take to get to a condition where we're at the satisfactory to good?
If we maintain consistent funding and we're able to keep our contractors rolling and they didn't, get, distracted by other opportunities in the state, I guess, we could probably have, I would say, most of our streets, to hit that 17 million, maybe, 10 years or something. So I think it's a long process, probably less than 10 years.
How long does it take from any one street from the time that it gets paved to the time that it will next get paved? I'm just curious of that life cycle.
It varies based on
Well, the
I guess,
frequency of use.
what happens there, but if a street gets fresh pavement on it, for example, and there's no major development projects or utility projects that have a negative impact on the pavement, we can get 15 to 20 years out of a freshly paved street. But typically what happens is there's, a water line break or something like that in the wintertime, and the utility folks have to do an emergency repair, which obviously cuts into the street system, and then, the degradation accelerates after that.
Has there been above normal utility work done recently, or is it pretty consistent? I just feel like I've seen a lot more of that across the city
That I do
in the
not
last year.
know. I would say they're always working to improve and become
There's another
more efficient and
infrastructure
get more
piece that
done.
we're.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this slide here is kind of trying to just, I guess, bring home a similar point, but more related to our traffic signals and that kind of infrastructure. We've got 76 signalized intersections in Charlottesville, and 33 of those have pretty much exceeded their life expectancy. We got a lot of data from the National Cooperative Highway Research Program, and they kind of give a range for traffic infrastructure between 20 and 30 years is pretty much the life expectancy, and after 30 years, it's pretty much degraded to a point where it's probably not really functional, as we would like it to be. And so, what we show in that table at the top, we have a total of 33 signals that have exceeded that 30-year lifespan. And to replace all of those signals, for example, would be about $8.2 million. Obviously, that's a really large investment just in any given year, and there's a reality that we couldn't probably coordinate that much work in a given year. And so what we've proposed this year is kind of trying to focus on a couple intersections at a time. So that's what this year's current CIP is. It's just enough money to do 2 intersections. And we're also looking to engaging a structural engineer to go out and look at our signal poles and mast arms to make sure that structurally they're sound enough to stay. And if that may.
And is this a different conversation from the signalization?
Yeah. The
Is that a different-
synchronizing.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, this is more related to the actual
Just
structural integrity
structure,
of our intersections, just their life
So
expectancy.
those dollars amount, that's
Something different.
would you do that at this simultaneously, or is it done at a different time?
No, the ITS, CIP, the Intelligent Transportation System, that's really more geared towards how the signals communicate with one another.
Yeah.
And so we're in the process of upgrading and fixing all of our equipment so our signals can communicate from one to the other. And then when we get all that equipment fixed, basically we can undergo a optimization process, which gets all the timing and everything correct, so that when you're driving down the road, for example, the lights turn green consecutively or something like that. It just improves traffic flow.
So you can still do that even with this older infrastructure?
Yes, you can. Yep.
And
'Cause
how's it impacted once it's changed?
Pardon me?
How is it impacted once you install new
Signals,
infrastructure?
yeah.
So if the communication equipment using like antennas and radios and things like that, you can transfer that from intersection to intersection. And so, for example, if we invested money in the communication equipment for a signal, and then 2 years later we get the funds to replace that signal, for example, we can utilize that same components of that intersection and save costs that way.
And you said 2 intersections are proposed for this budget cycle.
Correct.
Which ones?
It's Rugby and Barracks, and Emmett and Massey, I believe, are the 2 we submitted. And they're 2 of the more older signals.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, Vice Mayor. I think you'll recall back at the retreat, Dr. Richardson had spoke about the potential for a new City Hall project in the works. And that was an outcome of doing some visual inspection of the current state of our facilities, both the City Hall, the City Police building, as well as the City Annex facility. And when you look at those facilities and the age that they're in, most certainly the Mickey Building, 1925, which is the first section where NDS is in the City Hall location. It's about 14,800 square feet of space. That particular section is the original building on the corner. It's already far exceeded its service life. When you go around to the next building, which is the City Hall addition that was performed in 1967, that elevator is original to the structure. It's far surpassed its service life, and so, we're looking at having issues with serviceability and the cost to replace and upgrade that particular equipment. So when you take a lot of these factors into consideration, things like switch gear, rooftop units, the mechanical systems in the building.
One second,
Yeah.
do you mind if you call us to order now?
I call this meeting to order.
My apologies, I had a meeting that ran unavoidably late. I'm sorry.
And Councilor Bellamy and Councilor Galvin will not be in attendance this evening.
Sorry, thank you.
So the overall picture of the City Hall facilities is that they've reached their maximum useful life in terms of security, the components therein of the building, and the functionality of the building itself. The police department in particular is struggling to operate in those facilities. They're antiquated given the line of business that they do. So in doing an analysis of, you want to go to the next slide? Doing some basic analysis of, if you were to construct new facilities, what would that mean in terms of a savings? Most certainly you could think of the energy envelope and the fact that the buildings as they are, even though we've done energy improvements, a new facility would certainly save a considerable amount of energy, and we have not modeled that yet, but those numbers will be forthcoming. One of the largest savings is in preventative maintenance and repair, and so we modeled the existing building stock of those 4 structures, as well as a city complex of actually slightly larger footprint through CBRE, which is a space planning software. And when you do the analysis based on the life cycle, 50-year life cycle of the building components, you could actually realize a savings of about $983,000 in preventive maintenance over that first 10-year cycle. And that's an average per year savings based on a brand new building that would be in service versus maintaining the existing buildings that we have. It's interesting to note that the recapitalization over the last 13 years at City Hall has been about $5.3 million. So we've made some significant investments in the building, but at some point those investments no longer yield a benefit, in terms of the value of the buildings. So we're going to continue to do some analysis and come up with a cash flow model that can evaluate the difference between operating in our existing buildings or constructing a new facility and what that would mean for our bottom line.
And that'll be lined up along with the overall cost of this projected building and what, if the investment goes there, I'm specifically, interested in what it means for the affordable housing and the school projects.
Correct. And so there'll be some other inputs in that cash flow model, available equity of the existing properties. There's operational savings. Consolidation yields quite a few opportunities to save. And in looking at a proposed complex that would bring together the city school administration and several units of the city that are right now located in different housing, that consolidation in itself would yield a savings.
But in terms of priority, like in the city, what you can do at the same time
Right.
is what the questions that I'll be asking.
And I think that's fair to ask, and that'll be something, once we have tighter numbers in terms of financial analysis and our ability to pay debt service, that'll be a conversation that'll be down the road just a bit.
And we, in parallel, just for the public's information, like we are looking at our entire city school system and all of its facilities as well. It's not
That's-
just unique to the city facilities.
And for many of the same reasons.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna jump
we,
back in and,
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. Did we talk about? I didn't get a chance to see this beforehand. So did we talk about the city center already?
The what?
The city center complex.
That's what he was just going over, yeah. He
Okay,
was,
sorry,
he laid
sorry,
this out.
just kidding.
Yeah. Just the age of the buildings, and
Yeah.
I think you came in just after that slide.
Cool. That's great. Does that include also? Do we know anything about whether that would be here or in a new look? Or
We're still working
Still
through that
completely notional.
to be
Okay.
able to define that location.
City
But we
properties.
want to have a location that can fit all those pieces together in terms of the square footage.
Because this is an asset that could be traded against the costs. there
That's one of our options that we're looking at.
stuff to even fund it. I mean, great.
Well, that's the whole thing, is because we don't want to interrupt other projects that are already funded. We wanted to be able to utilize some of our current assets to be able to offset those costs
Wow.
and then move forward with future capital projects without really impacting our debt service dollars.
So
Well, this
my
is-
concern with that would be, especially depending on what buildings, if they go out on the private market, what does that do for the area when you're talking about especially gentrifying areas? So I would want to know what the city also, when we're talking about buying up potentially properties with a land bank and developing on it, what could we do with the property that could generate and be additional assets versus selling them? Because if we put City Hall on the market, we know who is going to be able to afford City Hall. And is that what we want to, I would be concerned about that.
I understand. We'll have those conversations once we finalize our proposed plan in terms of, the overall appraisal of City Hall, as well as the cost of the overall consolidation of those buildings that we talked about.
So I was gonna jump back into the actual CIP, the adopted CIP for this year, FY '20 through '24, just to, sort of do a reminder, or refresher. This looks at the sources of the CIP. As you know, we fund from the CIP with a couple different sources. One is general fund cash through a transfer. We've used year-end surplus money per our policy. Anything over our 17%, we've put into the CIP. We've also issued bonds. And then, if you recall, we have a couple other small sources of revenue, but if you recall, last year, we also looked at a few of the projects that had been previously budgeted. We decided were no longer necessary, and so that equated to freeing up about another $1.8 million that we put back into the CIP for '20. So looking at the expenditure side, if you recall, this is sort of a
You said 1.8 million came from projects.
existing projects that either had been completed and that there were excess funds, or projects that we were no longer gonna do, and so we freed the cash up.
Based on, how was that determined?
Through conversations with project managers and departments.
Isn't that what you kind of discovered at the end of our cycle, that was allowing us to then not have to be as aggressive with some of the other revenue streams we were considering? Or was that a different thing? I can't remember. It was a similar number.
The biggest part of the revenue stream was the $850,000 savings in debt service that
Right,
we were
that's
able
what-
to do.
Thank you.
So just looking at the uses side of the CIP, we made a big commitment to affordable housing last year. We also added money in for the schools, to begin the reconfiguration conversation. And then, some of the other things, facilities, capital projects, public safety. And so this is, pretty much how you plan to spend your money. And we know that from years 22 through 24, that's sort of the plan, but that's always subject to reevaluation each year, so. The priorities that we set for CIP projects both last year and that we will continue to look at this year is, again, evaluating existing CIP projects, looking at, the status of those, where they are they still on target? Looking at the public housing redevelopment, we put in money, I think it was $3 million a year over the 5 years, but looking at that to see if we have more information on the timing of that project, and if what we want to do there. Again, the school reconfiguration project, that is still up for discussion and under consideration for where we want to do with that. The aging infrastructure, Paul and Marty have talked to you about, and then from the joint work session earlier this week, there was some conversation about some joint road projects, so.
The reduction in this transportation and access line on page 11, starting in fiscal year 2023.
What was that? Is that your question?
Yeah.
Do you recall,
West-
Ryan?
That's because we have $4 million a year in for West Main over 2021 and 22.
Okay.
And that $4 million drops off. And then there was a couple other larger sort of one-time projects, I believe.
The parking structure.
The parking structure is in there in 21 and 22 as well. So those are a couple of the big dollar amounts that equated to the larger numbers in the 1921 or 2021 and 22.
Between West Main and the parking structure, that was $9 million.
What is the, can you talk, the parking structure, can you,
The courts.
That's part of
there's
the
a
courts
courts
agreement.
and there was West Main, there were the two different, this is part of, this is the one here.
For the courts.
That's embedded in the court, okay.
This is part of the court's agreement.
And I feel, when we went through all these conversations last year, I just remember timing is like is a really big component, because if they're not shovel-ready for some of this, we're just holding dollars that could have been used. I'm just trying to figure out how are we playing that in. That comes up with a lot of the questions. We're talking about our priorities even. A lot of this funding that we've approved, I mean, I'm not even sure when some of those dollars will be expended. It might be really towards the end of the fiscal year, might not even be till next fiscal year.
We're going to talk
Okay.
about that a little bit.
All right, sorry.
Again, this is just sort of a recap of some of the bigger projects that are already contemplated in the 5-year CIP. You know, the affordable housing we've talked about, the general district court project, the parking structure, additional money for West Main, and then many of the school projects. A lot of those are, the $3 million was the ad last year for the reconfiguration and design planning, and then the CHS, the priority improvement projects was the $6 million, and then the CHS roof replacement was another $1
Yeah.
million.
So that whole 22 million
Correct.
is independent of any real rebuilding of any schools?
Except for the $3 million that we added.
Right, does the design phase?
That's correct.
Okay.
So now it's kind of when we start talking about the timing, addressing the timing issue, to your point. So right now, based on CIPs that were previously adopted and, previously adopted, there's $43 million worth of bonds that we've authorized or plan to sell for projects that have not yet begun. So that's capacity that we plan to use, but we have not used, because our strategy has been that we do not sell bonds actually until the project is either well underway or going to be completed within a 2-year time frame.
So this 43 million was within 24 months.
That 43 million is things that you've adopted in the budget, but we have not yet sold. So
But you expect to do
Correct.
within 24-month times.
we expect to sell at some point, but we won't sell until the project is within completion of 24 months. So we don't want to
Okay.
sell bonds until we're ready to actually spend the money. We don't want to sell bonds and
Yeah.
just sit on the money, basically.
Mhm.
Same thing, we want to look at the existing debt capacity. We're also looking at existing authorized projects that may no longer be necessary. So to Dr. Richardson's opening comments, and also what we've asked departments to do as part of their CIP submission, we are looking at projects that have been previously funded and or budgeted that have not been spent.
So previously authorized projects may no longer be necessary. And that is, so were these projects on the unfunded list or the funded list before?
They would be funded through the CIP. So these would be projects that already have budget and funding behind them, but perhaps have not started, or the scope has changed, or it's just been delayed for some reason. We're just revisiting all of that to find out what their actual spend rates are for those projects.
So what is this game of chess that's played to kind of say, okay, we have this amount of money and we want to make sure that we're utilizing it as efficiently and as quickly as possible for things that we want to get done. And maybe the things we committed to, we felt our priorities, but they're just not ready yet. Are we prepared to kind of have a plan to move things around because there are other things that, are ready now, but we're not saying we're not going to fund those other things, but I'm just trying to understand how that thought process works.
So if we go to the next slide,
I'm sorry, I didn't look at these slides before.
that's
but
okay. So To answer your question, for cash-funded projects that are in the adopted CIP, that cash just sits there. If the project is not going and has not started yet, and you want to reprogram that or retime that, the money's there and you can do that. It's just, you have to figure out if you have programmed cash for a project today that's not going to go through, 2 years from now, and you haven't spent that, and you're going to spend it on something else, then you got to know you got to come up with the cash again 2 years later. So on the bond side, we have not actually sold those bonds. So this is sort of what we do as part of our analysis every year. We actually are looking at what your plan is and comparing that to our policy and also our affordability in terms of what we can afford in terms of debt. And we basically are managing all of that stuff in terms of the timing of the projects and the plan that's been set forth in the CIP. So if you look at this table, the second column, the bond issue amount, those are either issues that we have already sold. So 2016 through 2019, those were actual bond issues. 20 through 25, I think that is, 26, those are what we plan. So if you looked at that, some of those numbers match to the CIP, some of those do not, because we're also making some assumptions about when you might sell the bonds for the things that you've authorized but we have not spent yet. So if you looked at the CIP, for example, in 2019, that 15,367 is the bondable amount for the 2019 CIP. But if you looked at the bondable amount in 2024, it's something less than that, and so we're hedging some bets on when you might sell bonds for projects that you've already authorized that just haven't happened. And so the third column, the debt service, correlates to what those bond issues were. This would be your annual debt service cost. And then we are comparing that to the general fund budget to get to our ratio, which is our 10% target that, our 10% policy, or a 9% target that we compare to. So we made some assumptions here about the growth of the general fund over time. We basically are assuming that we're going to have a modest growth of 1.5%. And as you'll see, we're basically edging up on our ratio, but we're still maintaining below our target. And then to the right of the blue line, this is sort of where the affordability piece comes in. So we are actually, the general fund transfer is the amount that we're actually transferring from the general fund to pay off our debt payments every year. But if you notice, for example, if we look at 2022, you'll notice that our debt payment is $15 million and our general fund transfer is only $12 million. We are actually using some balance that's in the debt service fund because in anticipation of needs in the future, we started bumping up our transfer to debt service. And so we are trying to minimize the impact on the general fund by using debt service. But as you'll see from this chart, all things play out as we put together. By the time you get to 2026, we've sort of spent down that fund balance in the debt service fund, and you're looking at a $17 million debt payment. So, I think some of the takeaways here are, one is that things that we've put together in the in the adopted CIP and projecting out in the future years, we are maintaining our policy. You are increasing what you're requiring from the general fund in terms of debt service. And the fund balance in the debt service fund that's sort of been helping offset some of that stress on the general fund is dwindling. So this is sort of the thing that we look at every year as we sort of adopt the CIP. And any number of these things could change what this picture looks like. So this is nothing that's set in stone except for the bonds that we've already sold. That debt's set. But the rest of it will change as the projects change, as our ideas change, and this is the process that we go through to make sure that we're keeping everything in check. Does that answer your question? Okay. The next slide, so just some statistics about our current debt. We have $87.7 million of general obligation bonds outstanding, 136 when you add in the debt for the utilities. As we talked about, our policy is to maintain 10% of our general fund budget with the goal of staying at 9 or below. And this is a very important policy from a rating perspective. So this is absolutely something that we talk about with them, and they calculate and rate us on, basically. Again, just to reiterate, you know, bonds aren't free. So every bond that we issue creates an additional expense for the city. We generally amortize that debt over 20 years. And every dollar of debt has to stand up to our policies. So that goes back to that table. That's why we're constantly always checking. And you know, we try to manage the CIP to stay within our policy and our affordability limits. And then just some general rules of thumb as you think about these things. $10 million of debt equates to about $1 million a year in debt service. And then the other aspect that I think Paul and Marty were touching on is that with every capital project, there are operational cost impacts that impact the general fund. And so that's, you know, in addition to the debt itself, there are operating impacts as well that we have to look at. And then finally, you know, what do we do to pay for this debt? We can increase taxes, which under the current scenario was not necessary and is not necessary. But as we add new projects or new increases to the CIP, you know, we can look at tax increases. We can look to the private sector. We can look at cuts in the general fund or department budgets, service cuts. Or we can reprioritize things that you've already planned that maybe aren't as important at this point and readjust priorities. And then finally, the favorite table that everybody likes to talk about.
The fact that you
at
even have it
some
in here,
point.
I'm just want to.
This is just a calculation based on our current revenue estimates of what a penny of each of these taxes are worth. I don't know if you have anything else you want to say or ask about that, or.
I have no interest in seeing this table again until next year.
Yeah, and so I think with that, Kevin, did you have anything you wanted to kind of jump in or summarize? Or?
Yeah, just my takeaways on it were, you know, you're looking at about the authorized but unissued is about 43 million. You have the 84 million programmed in there, so. You know, roughly programmed in that number that's keeping you under your policy is about 125, 127 million. So you're under it with that. So I think part of this, as you're thinking about it, is, you know, that's roughly what falls into those numbers. What projects do you have? You've identified some projects. Some projects were there before, but those numbers keep you within your policies. So I thought that was very important. You know, one of the exercises we go through every year as part of the bonding process is looking at you compared to your peer groups. And so we've thrown a couple charts in here looking at your unassigned fund balance, comparing that to other AAA ratios, as well as you know, your debt service as a percent of your expenditures. So, you know, both in terms of your unassigned fund balance, you're kind of right there in the middle where I'd say you need to be. In terms of your debt service, you're on the lower end, but as we saw, your ratios, you know, are projected to decline. This is always a tricky slide because it kind of really depends where you are in your borrowing cycle. We're sort of on the front end of this. You know, if you recall, years ago, we were doing, you know, $8 million, $10 million annual issuances, and now we're ramped up to programming about $20 million a year of issuances in there. So, and so your debt is escalating, but I think as the as the manager started out with, looking at things like increasing your annual pay-go for certain items is certainly a way to keep your debt down, is a good thing to look at as you go through this, so.
And these peer groups, are they all rated the same as we are?
No, a lot of these are, what we looked at is Virginia cities for this peer group, and then, Albemarle's in there being your neighbor, that are highly rated. A lot of these are AA+. There's some AAA entities in there based on Moody's, but highly rated Virginia entities that have a population of less than 100,000 other than Albemarle County.
And I guess just one other note, as we start developing the budget and when we start work sessions, we will have information on our budget webpage that you can find, PowerPoints or supporting information. Also, always, we have the interfacing with the Balancing Act program, the budget visualization, and then Open Charlottesville, which is our open data and has several different links to just different data that you want.
Just in terms of what this budget cycle is gonna look like in terms of the meetings and our involvement, it's just helpful just to kind of get a sense for how that's gonna be. Like, we have a couple more meetings this calendar year with this current council, and then do we anticipate, for whatever reason, like last spring just seemed really intense. And so I'm just trying to already plan ahead and get those dates on calendars and have a reality check around how much we're meeting. Is it really necessary? I'm just trying to get a sense for how, if we're looking at this differently and if it's gonna be a different approach that involves council.
So we've gone ahead and planned out all of our public meetings for the 21 budget process, and we've kind of followed the same schedule as we have in the past. It's always open for discussion and changes as we get into it. But right now, with the current council, we're looking at the November work session is the next one. We have another one scheduled in December. Those would be the last two with the current makeup of this council. And then after the new council comes on board, I know there's going to be a discussion about a possible retreat, and that would be kind of the kickoff with the new council. We have set up the same 4 work sessions and the community budget forum as we've done in the past to provide with the proposed budget. We feel like the way we've developed that and broken that out into those work sessions, we can look at that and potentially doing something different. I know this is Dr. Richardson's first year here, and we definitely want.
That's why I was asking, just because.
Yeah, no, I mean, nothing is set in stone at this point. Everything is up for change and reorganization, but given what we knew at the time, we went ahead and set those up in that format, and then we can, as we get into it, we can look at it and make adjustments as we need to.
Because it's also challenging that 2 pretty important sessions are happening with, in this case, like 3, not even a quorum of the council will be here in January when we actually get into the crux of this. And so you said that, I think it all goes after the election, so anyone is going to be present and participating as indirectly. We actually sat at the table, I think, in December. So that's where I'm trying to get my head around that too, because it's important that I think the 5 people who are going to be approving this budget are a part of that entire process.
So yeah, as
No
we
offense.
always do, once we
taken.
no offense, yeah, as we move forward, once we know who the new 3 incoming council members will be, who the council-elect members are, any information that we're sending to the current council will also be shared with the council-elect members, so that they're having that information. They're at least they're invited to all the work sessions to watch and learn and observe and hear the discussion, so that they'll be more informed when they start in January. The November one is typically, again, our work session on the CIP, just because of the timing of how our process works. And December is kind of our let's touch base, start the budget process. We look at some of the budget guidelines, and we go over long-term forecasts, look at very, very rough preliminary projections and stuff to kick off that conversation. But I hear what you're saying about it only being 2 out of the 5 that would be involved in those meetings. But again, we're always going to be sharing that information so that those other individuals are involved. And it's an imperfect system because of the timing of our budget cycle, and the timing of elections, but we feel, that's why we tend to backload those work sessions after the January, because there will be another one in January, and then February we'll have another work session to kind of, the first real budget work session with that whole group after the retreat, and then once the proposed budget comes out, that's when we really get into the meat of budget changes, once, Dr. Richardson presents his budget to you, we start seeing how you want to adjust that.
And we will be doing a session that will include nonprofit funding. Can you just kind of update on how that's been going, just because it's kind of fallen off of my immediate radar, and I know that some agencies have asked about it, and I just want to be clear with kind of where we are.
We released the applications 2 weeks ago, I believe it was, August
Okay.
27th, 29th. I don't remember the exact date off the top of my head. They're not due until the end of October is typically when they come in, and then at that point, we will, the review team will be convened. I know Gretchen Ellis and Kaki and that whole team over there, Shayla Givens, that are running that process, have been setting up the meetings and organizing the groups and getting things, and working out all the logistics of once that stuff comes in, we'll be ready. There have been 4 orientations, one at the city, or 2 with the city and 2 at the county on these, this process.
So wait, how did that end up? I didn't even.
It's just there is some overlap on, I'm blanking right now, but the majority of this is the agencies that we've been doing the kind of joint orientations at both places.
But is the county following their traditional process?
They're following
still?
their traditional
Okay.
process. We've just been doing it. They're all still using the Zoom grants platform, and in an effort to simplify it for the agencies, we continue to, instead of having to fill out one for the United Way and one for the city and one for the county, we have still using that same common platform. As you fill out the applications, when you click on certain questions, it will direct you towards a different set of questions. It's kind of has that decision tree as it moves through, so that you'll be able, if you say, oh, I'm applying for county funds only, you start answering just the county questions. And if I'm city funds only, then there's the different breakouts for the various pots that we had set out within the Vibrant Communities Fund. So that's at the beginning phases, and we'll be, I'm sure there's going to be more reports as we continue to go through it when we come back to council with it.
And those meetings were just last week, right?
The
The week
orientations,
before.
they were the first.
Like 2 weeks?
First
or
week
what?
I think it was the 3rd and the 4th, I believe, of
September.
Of September, yeah, it was right at the very beginning of September, that first week of September, so.
And it was like a morning and an afternoon
Yes,
session.
that's correct.
So they had-
Mhm.
I've just heard people using the language, so I'm like, oh, it's out there. I'm glad.
Yeah, yep.
It's gonna be fun. Always is. All right,
Any other questions?
out of here in an hour.
Yeah, I just have the question of how do you reduce and cut, streamline, and do everything that needs to be done?
Well, like I said before, we'll look at, as was mentioned throughout the presentation, we're going to look at current expenditures as well as future projects and see where they are, and then make that determination across the board. But that also will be a part of the overall O&M side of the budget too.
Any other? All right, are there any questions from members of the public? No? All right,
Thank you.
meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.